Okay, here we go. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me this morning. I'm Lucy and this is Rachel.
Hi.
And we are here to celebrate the Mairtín Crawford Awards, which are organised each year by the Belfast Book Festival and held in association with the Crescent Arts Centre. Some of you might know Mairtín. He was a writer whose work spanned many genres, including poetry, journalism, screenwriting. He was a creative writing tutor at the Crescent for several years and was the director of the Between the Lines Festival, which then became the Belfast Book Festival, of which I'm very proud to be a patron. Mairtín died suddenly in 2004, and these awards for the short story and for poetry in his memory, in his name, are such a wonderful tribute to a writer and a man who, in the words of the poet Moira Donaldson, judge of the Poetry Awards, wrote as he lived with a combination of intelligence and daring revolutionary spirit and generosity of heart. The award sponsors for this year are CILIP Ireland, the Library Professionals Network, who make a contribution towards the cash prize for the winner, and the Bullet Hotel, who provide accommodation for the residency element. So these awards are specifically set up for writers who are just at the start of their writing life, maybe working towards their first collection of stories, their first collection of poems. And Rachael and I are going to discuss today everything that you need to get started writing a short story. And then we're going to look specifically at award submission and what judges might be looking for. So Rachael Kelly writes under the name of R.B. Kelly, and her debut novel Edge of Heaven was shortlisted for the Arthur C. Clarke Award and the European Science Fiction Society Award for Best Work of Fiction, and the sequel On the Brink was published just last year. Her short stories have been widely anthologized and are published in journals around the world, including the Best of British Science Fiction, Aurealis and Lamplight magazine. Rachael has a PhD in film theory, and her thesis was published by Bloomsbury in 2014. And Rachel's been the first sifter on these boards. So she's been the first reader of all the stories for the last couple of years. And then for the last 2 years has been my co-judge on the stories. So we're going to discuss all of that, Rachael, ins and outs of short stories. But first of all, I want to say, we're going to keep this informal, we're going to keep it very chatty, and we want to get to as many of your specific questions and concerns as possible. So if you do have any questions, start putting them in the chat and I'll try to get to as many as I can in the last bit of the session. But first, Rachael, the deadline for these awards, double check everything I say on the website, but as far as I'm aware, the deadline is the 30th of April. And so there's still time to get writing. There's still time to write. Even if you've never written a short story before, there's still time to give one a go, to write one from scratch in that time period. And so, Rachael, I wanted to ask you first, if someone has maybe been toying with the idea of writing a short story, they want to give it a go, they've never written one before, or they want to write one specifically for this competition, where do you look for inspiration?
I think inspiration can come from literally anywhere. I tend to keep like a little book with me these days. Well, it used to be like a little physical book that I would carry with me, and when something just caught my attention, maybe sort of a turn of phrase somewhere, a particular image that I was struck by, a newspaper story, an interesting walk of somebody in a supermarket, I would just make a little note of it, because you never know what that's going to feed into. These days I do it on my phone. I tend to email myself, which is not the best way of doing it, but it's just, writers have to be magpies, I think, but our shiny things are the little details of life that can just be fascinating, on the very small scale, or on a large scale as well, I suppose. But these days I'm finding it really useful to use prompts as well. I never used to do that, but these more recently I've found that just getting me started, just giving me some kind of loose idea and setting me off, and sort of that, I find that really useful as well. But I mean, literally anything can serve as inspiration for a short story. Nothing is ever wasted, and it's those little details that make a short story really come to life.
Yeah, I'm the same. I have I always used to have a shoebox,
Yeah.
and I'd cut newspaper articles, or if I was at the hairdresser's reading a magazine or something, I would kind of sneakily rip the
Yep.
corner of the page.
Oh, I've done that. Yes.
Yeah, these days I do it on my phone as well. I have snatches of ideas, snatches of dialogue. I have one specific note on my phone for anytime my dad remembers anything that his Gran Robinson used to say, and it goes, she ran away like a lilty. I think is the title of that
Brilliant.
document. Yeah, it's collecting all of these things, isn't it? Because I think that sometimes, for me, where a short story comes from is there might be one spark or one trigger,
Yes.
almost like a flame, and you've got all of this kindling, you've got all of this lived experience, you've got all of these things that you yourself have experienced, and then something happens for me where a couple of things might come together.
Yes. Yes, and it is almost like that kind of alchemy, isn't it? Because the way it comes together for me is never the same for two short stories. The most recent one I wrote, I just finished it last week actually, and it came from, I had a sort of a theme that I wanted to explore, which was set externally, that came from a prompt, but the first line was what brought the story together. I had the vaguest of themes, and this one line, and I knew that was how it started, but then I had to work out what happened next. So it is, the alchemy of a short story is different every single time. For another one, it was an image that I just thought, well, okay. Well, I mean, I'm a speculative fiction writer. So the image, I thought, what happens if I add a ghost? Okay. And then we go from there. But so that's my mantra from now on. What happens if I add a ghost? And see.
Yeah, it's lovely. I love Anne Enright always calls fiction the great what if.
Yes.
And she said that's the basis for anything. And she says, as children, we do it so naturally. We pick up a fish finger and kind of, we zoom it across the room, and then it turns into a missile hitting our younger sister. That's what happens in my family anyway. But then
video's gone.
Rachael, yeah, you need to go and come back. There you are. So yeah, the great what if. Yes. I think that's a lovely place to start, because it allows you to go writing very, very closely from your own life. What if you had taken a very different, a very small different decision, or the what if allows you to hypothesize, in a scenario like you might have, what if science fiction plus ghosts?
Yes. Yeah. Another really lovely idea, I was sort of discussing with a number of other writers about 6 months ago, and they said that one of the most interesting bits of advice they'd been given was, what if I make it more difficult for my character at this point? How can I make it more difficult, and what happens if at this point I make things more difficult? So I think that's a really good thing to bear in mind as well, as the source of narrative comes from conflict. And what if you deepen that conflict? What if you make it harder for the character to come up to push through that obstacle? What if you put another obstacle in their way? Sometimes that's where you get really, really interesting character information, and sometimes that's where you get really, really interesting narrative flowing from that. What if you make it more difficult?
That's so interesting, because I always, the length of this short story for the Mairtín Crawford, it's up to 2,500 words. And I always think that's a really useful length to be able to turn a story around in. I write quite a lot for radio, and if you're commissioned to write that 15-minute slot for the BBC, or if RTE are broadcasting one of their shorter stories, it's always 2,100 words.
Right.
And sometimes I think if the actor talks kind of fast, I can get away with 2,200. Never. But 2,100 words, it's a good taut amount of words to be able to turn a whole story in. And the question I always ask myself, kind of akin to you, Rachael, is why this day?
Yeah.
What is it about this day? Why are we seeing this character on this day? Because what I find is that when you don't have many words, and sometimes this is a first draft problem, sometimes when you don't know very much, you're writing your way into the story, you're writing your way into the world.
Yes.
And maybe for you that's scaffolding, but that doesn't need to belong in the short story as it's finished.
Yeah.
And so what I would always do is I'd do the draft and the writing, and then I'd ask myself the question of, what changes on this? Why aren't we seeing yesterday? Why
Yeah.
aren't we seeing the day after? Why is it very, very important for us to see this moment in the character's life? And I think there's something to do with the nature of a short story, that we are seeing not necessarily the epiphany or the moment, but we are seeing the time that something changes. You know, something has to be fundamentally different by the end of that short story than it was at the beginning. And it doesn't need to be something very dramatic. You know, maybe it's that a character has lost something or gained something. Maybe it's that they've realized something, or maybe it's that they've been suppressing or not wanting to know something, and by the end of the story they can't not know anymore. You know, it can be sort of as small and subtle as that, but I think there has to be that fundamental difference by the end of the story. I always think that a good way of judging your story is you cannot go back to how things were before.
I talk about status quo at the beginning and status quo at the end, and you've reached equilibrium again, but equilibrium looks fundamentally different, because if it didn't, what was the point of us following this character on their journey? If everything looks exactly the same at the end as it did at the beginning, then why are we invested in seeing this particular moment? I think of a short story I read years ago. I'm sorry, I apologize, it's not very pleasant subject matter, but it was in the best American short stories anthology from about 30 years ago. It's called Morphine, and at the beginning of the story, the protagonist, our lead protagonist, is bedbound in the final stages of terminal breast cancer, and she's on very heavy dose of morphine, just because, you know, because the end is near, and at the end of the story, she's bedbound in the final stages of terminal breast cancer on a very heavy dose of morphine. So ostensibly nothing has changed throughout the course of that story, but through the journey we've been on with her, through her mind, through her revisiting various aspects of her life, looking back at her childhood, looking at her relationship with her grandfather, her relationship with her husband, and her relationship with herself, we've come to understand her much better, and she's come to understand herself much better, and she's come to forgive herself for some of the choices that she's made throughout her life, which is obviously much shorter than she would have hoped it would be. And she starts off feeling quite unfulfilled with the decisions that she's made, but by the end of it, by going through those steps with her, we've understood why those were the decisions that she had to make at that time, and why it wasn't actually the waste that she has kind of configured it as. So by the end of the story, while ostensibly nothing has changed externally, the internal life of that character is very, very different. And I think it was one of the first times that it really clarified for me that the change that needs to happen doesn't need to be sort of this huge external change, but a significant internal change is more than interesting enough to catch and hold the reader's attention, as long as it's developed with confidence and with respect for the character, and with understanding of the character, and with depth. And I mean, obviously that was a short story that was very, very widely respected, went on to be anthologized as the best of the year. So yeah, I think it's knowing what that change is and understanding the change, really, that, you know, it doesn't need to be earth shattering on the outside, but it is for the character themselves. I think one of the bits of advice I love to quote is Kurt Vonnegut: always start as close to the end as you possibly can. And that's, you know, if a short story spends too much time in exposition, it doesn't have the luxury of a lot of exposition.
I'm going to see your Kurt Vonnegut and raise you Mary Lavin.
Okay, then.
She always says a short story needs to be an arrow in flight.
Oh, I love that.
I love the sense that when it begins, it's already, you know, you can feel that tautness. It's already in motion. It's already happening. I want to talk a bit more about that, actually, Rachel. But first, I want to say there's one thing I think it might be important and useful for people to hear. That when we're talking about where to get started, I think there are as many ways as there are different writers. And I think that one of the ways that I think of a short story is I just let the characters talk to me in my head. You know, I'm forever sort of wandering around daydreaming, or, you know, gazing out the window on a bus. Or the other day I was walking my son to school, and it's like a 7 or 8 minute walk, and we were talking, and I was very wrapped up in some story I was telling him, and he said to me, you know, Mummy, why have we gone this way? And turned down a completely random road and and it's like the walk to school is not particularly complicated, but I was so wrapped up in my thoughts, and I thought I'm always getting lost in places, and that's because quite often if I'm walking along, I'm just emptying myself and just letting my characters talk in my head. And quite often the moment that I start writing a story is when the voices become quite loud, and I can hear them very clearly. I can hear the tone, I can hear the rhythms, I can hear what they're saying. And so, while we're talking about, sitting in a cafe eavesdropping and, writing people's phrases, or going to a museum and choosing an object, or a story that catches your attention in a newspaper, I think sometimes, the walking along and listening to yourself, or exploring a tiny different path your life might have taken, those are for me, that's sometimes as much of the work. It's one of the really strange things about being a writer, that it's not always evident when the work is being done.
Yes, so much of that work is not actually the putting the words on the page, it's the thinking about the words that go on the page, which I suppose part of the process of learning your own process as a writer is about learning the point at which it becomes important to put the words on the page. I think certainly in the earlier stages of my writing, I would have been quite bad at knowing when was the point that, okay, stop thinking about it, now start writing it. So and the danger is, of course, while it exists in your head, it's kind of perfect and inviolate, and then you put it on the page and then it doesn't quite look satisfying, so there's a fear.
I always, I'm putting together a session a session for my own masterclass at the moment, and what I'm doing is I'm saying this is actually what a first draft of a story looks like. This story is going to be the final story in my new collection, and it'll look polished, and but I'm going to say this is how it started, like on my phone, and this is what a first draft actually looks like. Because I think it's always one of the most important things for writers to know when you're getting started, is that first draft probably is all over the place. It's probably
a mess.
And I always think that if you were a sculptor, you'd have your bit of driftwood, or you'd have your your Bernini, and you've chosen your block of marble. But if you're a writer, and then the work is chipping away and chiseling away, but if you're a writer, you have to generate that thing before you can do anything more to it.
And you have to, the first draft has to have permission to be a mess as well. It has to have the ability to just go wherever you need, and it can just sort of shoot off in a weird and wonderful direction. And if that turns out not to be productive, well, that's okay. It had permission to go in that direction before you sort of reined it in and went, actually no. But that first draft can be an absolute, I know writers that call that their junk draft, or their garbage draft, because it's literally just putting words down on a page so that there is something to sculpt. The second draft is where the polish comes in.
Words or something. For me, that's the pure pleasure. When you're writing this first draft, it can go anywhere, and you've got the idea. And so, Rachael, what do you do when you have got your first sort of rough draft? You've had this image, you've had this idea, you've thrown a ghost in, you've kind of written. How do you then start thinking, okay, where is the story? I mean, I guess that's where we start asking ourselves the why this day question, the how much is exposition, like Kurt Vonnegut, David Mamet, so many people say they just chop off the beginning because it's exposition, or it's limbering up. David Mamet says he always cuts the first scene because it's always warm up, and he cuts the last because it's always indulgent.
I like that.
So how do you sort of put manners on your first draft? How do you give it shape? How do you work out what the story actually is?
Well, I leave it alone. Now I'm never quite as good at leaving it alone for as long as I think it should be left alone. I would advise writers to leave it alone for much longer than I ever do. But I think that first draft, it sort of pours out of you in however many fits and starts, and it arrives on the page. And then there's that sense of relief. Okay, I know I've got a beginning, middle, and an end, and I know it's a mess, because I mean my process for short stories is completely different from my process for novels, which the more I think about it, the older I get, the more I think it's because I hate editing so much. I cannot face going through the process that I go through with a short story for something as long as a novel. So I have the novel much more planned out in my head. With a short story, I'll start with one tiny little thought, or one tiny little idea, or one image, and I'll just pour it onto the page and see what happens. So by the time I've got to the end, there is that sense of relief that, okay, fine, there is actually a story there, and I now have a vague idea of what the story is. But then if I don't leave it alone, I know too much about it. If I go straight back to it, I know too much about what was in my mind when I was writing it, if I go straight back to it. So for me, the most productive thing is usually to start working on something else immediately afterwards, so that becomes the story in my head.
So interesting, because there I'm the complete opposite.
Oh,
I
really?
can hold different worlds alive with that intensity.
Okay.
You know, I get, as we're going to say, you know, there are as many ways of doing this as there are different writers. But Rachael, do you ever, once you've got that first draft, do you ever make fundamental changes in, say, point of view and tense? I think is always very important to consider. You know, point of view being, is this told in the third person with a sort of omniscient narrator? You know, is it a God's eye point of view, or is it a sort of camera sort of just above the character's consciousness, or is it first person narrated by the character themselves? Is it a sort of choral, you know, we pronoun, or is it second person? I do a lot of second person, which is we. You know, it's told as, you know, you are not the kind of person who finds themselves in a situation like this, or, you know, 2 days before your birthday, you know, that second person. And then tenses as well. There's, say, present tense and past tense, most easily, but there's also future tense, conditional tense, much harder to pull off. But do you ever fundamentally change those sort of things, or how do you consider your point of view? How do you consider your tense when you're writing something?
That's a really, really good question. And I tend to be not very scientific about things like that. I tend to do that very much by feel, and a story will feel as though it's a third person past tense, or although it's a first person past tense, you know, third person present tense. I love second person. I have never yet managed to get somebody to publish a second person piece of fiction of mine without insisting that I transpose it to the first person, which fine. I love second person, and I don't think there's enough love for it. And I'm delighted that you've kind of embraced that and made that your thing, because, you know, it's great to have somebody of your status championing the second person, and maybe we can change hearts and minds. But I think there's one instance that stands out for me, a story that I published last year, which, I mean, I literally started writing that in my teens, so it was a very long time ago, and I was a very different kind of writer back then, and I obviously didn't have the same kind of insight into my process. I wasn't as sort of informed about what it was that the short story could do and should do. And I had it told originally from a completely different character perspective, and by changing the point of view character I kept it again. Oh no, I didn't. I transposed from first to third as well. I'd forgotten about that. But for me,
Sorry, go ahead.
The most significant thing for me was realizing that it was not the story of the person I'd originally put as the point of view character. It was a completely different person's story, and by changing that point of view, and by changing whose story it was I was telling, with exactly the same narrative, more or less, that was when the story actually unlocked, and that was the version of it that got published.
So interesting. Yeah, sometimes if I'm not sure, I will just, and this is the lovely thing about short stories, if you're making a change, you know, if you've got a 2,000 word story, you can write it a couple of different ways, you know, just sort of type it out. And it's not like making that commitment for a whole novel, but sometimes I will write something and, you know, changing it from first person to third person. It isn't as simple a deal as, you know, like finding and changing all the I's to she's, or, you know, changing tense. It isn't just adding ed to all the verbs, because something, the fabric of it all changes, the tone of it all changes. Can we rattle through very quickly, maybe, Rachael, some of the strengths and weaknesses, say, of first person, third person, second person, present tense, past tense sort of thing? What would you see? You've been talking about changing a story from first person to third person. What would you say are the advantages of a first person narrator?
It's much more conversational. It's you can make it much less formal. You can make it feel as though you're just sitting down for a chat with somebody. So you have much greater feeling of intimacy and a greater feeling of access to the character. I do tend to use it with caution, because for me that benefit is also its drawback, because it can then the danger is that the whole story becomes conversational and interior, without actually being able to access the action as the reader. So that's one thing I do see a lot with first person work stories that I would see, or I would work with, is that we're seeing too much reported action rather than actually being able to experience it, as it were. So and I think the other thing for me about first person is that people often assume that that is going to be, quote unquote, a more immediate way of telling the story. But actually, first person, in some ways, you can, although the closeness is there between, that's the conversational style, in first person, you're at the mercy of what that character chooses to reveal. So in fact, if that character just chooses to sidestep or deflect, there isn't the distance there for you to see them doing that. Whereas in third person, you have a bit more of a, although, when third person limited, we're still in one person's perspective at a time. But you have that slight bit of distance where you can actually see that the character is not being entirely honest, often, not always. So yeah.
It's so interesting because, Rachael, my first novel was published 17 years ago, actually, and it's only in the last couple of years that I found myself able to write in the third person.
Oh, really?
Because I would find myself completely self-conscious and so tangled up with who is doing the observation on behalf of these characters. Yeah. I found it, say, with first person, I could just ventriloquize. Right. And if it was the character and I was there with them and I could hear their voice and I could talk in their voice, I think that's a playwright in me. And then I started writing in second person when I was finding that my first person narrator, as you say, was a bit too limited. Maybe a character was... maybe they were depressed, or maybe they didn't like themselves enough, or maybe there was too much they were blocking themselves from knowing. Or I would find that if I told a story in first person past tense, it's almost as if we're getting anecdote, we're getting a summary of something that has happened, that is over, that has been resolved. And so the stakes felt less high from the beginning. And so that's when I found I started writing second person, not asking the reader to role play, but that conversation that you have in your head with yourself, maybe that conversation with a higher part of you, or a better part of you, or maybe a future part of you. So in my stories in the second person, I kind of positioned the reader as almost eavesdropping. The reader had to kind of watch this very important, very dramatic interaction between the character and themselves, really. And the reader was asked to just kind of hold their breath and listen. I got this lovely sense of intimacy, and I found that allowed me to get closer to my characters than before. And then I found that it's only been in recent years that I've been able to write well in third person. Okay. Again, there are writers who find it the complete opposite, that they can write very naturally in third person and find the sort of performance or the character or the sort of monologue or ventriloquism of first person very, very different. So again, I think it's finding, it's testing and trying what comes to you naturally, isn't it? And I think especially when you're starting out, I think you do tend to devalue what comes to you naturally, what comes to you easily. I certainly did that when I was starting.
I think, and that's something that I do try and say a lot in classes, is that your instincts are generally good, because you've grown up in a story world. You've grown up in a world where you've been constantly exposed to narrative and story and novels and films and short stories and conversations. So you understand at a very fundamental sense, even if you don't understand it, you understand it. You do have a really good sense of how this operates. So if you feel strongly that this should go in a particular way, there's usually a very good reason for that. And so I would tend to sort of try and encourage people to trust their instinct and trust their intuition. You do have a much better sense usually of storytelling than you think you do. And I think sometimes reading a lot of books about it can kind of encourage you not to trust that instinct, because that's one of the problems I have. But I love the sort of the multiplicity of different sort of help books for writers that are just trying to find their voice and find their way on the journey. But I think sometimes those books can be quite prescriptive in that, well, this is what worked for me, so therefore this is what I think you should be doing. And if that doesn't work for you, then it leads you to sort of stop trusting your instincts and go, well, there must be something wrong with my process, which probably not. It's probably just that your process doesn't look like that. And I think, for writers who plan a lot in advance, and like I said, my novels, I plan them down to like scene by scene breakdown before I start writing them. Completely different with short stories. But you find a lot of sort of scene by scene breakdown authors very firmly convinced that is the best and only way to write a novel. And if you're not that kind of writer, then trying to force yourself to write that way is just going to result in you not writing. So trust your instincts, I think, is the key thing. You are the best person to say what works for you. Try lots of different things, try lots of different, experiment, explore. It's about finding what works for you, and that's going to be completely different for every writer.
Definitely. Rachael, at what stage would you share a draft with someone? Because I think that it's really important, isn't it? Like who you get feedback from, and when you get feedback. Because when I was starting out, I would always give my stories to my mum, mainly because, and now that I have children, my children bring me their stories, and I'm just so proud and delighted that they've written anything at all. And kind of that's what I needed when I was starting. I just needed someone to say, this is brilliant. But, as I started writing more, I stopped giving my stories to my mum because it felt like I was asking permission. It felt, and it's funny, I was thinking, my husband, he never reads work in progress. He's an architect. He's not a big reader. And he will, if I gave him a draft of something, he would likely say, you don't mean a Velux window, you mean a Crittall window. Which at the right point is very useful criticism, but that getting the wrong feedback will enrage you and put that relationship into jeopardy, I think. And so I think it's very important when you're sharing work with people to be very clear on what exactly are you asking for, especially if you're just starting work and maybe a partner or a loved one is interested. It's always useful to ask, what do I want as I'm sharing this? What do I want their response to be? Am I asking for, approval? Am I asking for their permission? Like what is it that I'm doing here? And so I think it's very important, especially if you're starting to get together with a couple of like-minded people, to swap work with people who are also writing, who are also at the same stage. I did that when I was starting out, and I still do it now. I have a couple of writer friends that I will swap work with them, and they will swap work with me, asking for specific feedback,
And that's part of the learning process as well, is learning what feedback you need to ask for. The other thing, I think it's absolutely fine to have somebody who you give your work to purely for cheerleading, as long as you also have somebody whose constructive criticism you trust. I am very much the same. My mum has read everything I've ever written, and sometimes that's useful for me because she doesn't read science fiction. I am the only science fiction author that she will ever read in her entire life, most likely. So I know that if there's something there that doesn't make sense, she is going to pick up on it, because she doesn't necessarily have a lot of intricate knowledge about the genre, and so she'll be able to pick up on something and go, well, what does that mean? But equally, I'm not looking for constructive feedback from her, because that's not what mums do. I'm not sure if my kids were to give me something, I could give them constructive feedback on it. It would be very much like, oh, that's wonderful and I adore it unconditionally. I think for me, I would only ever give something to somebody once I was sure that I had got it to the best I could get it without sort of external input. But then that's very much just me. I know plenty of writers who like to give their garbage draft to somebody and just sort of say, right, what do you think of that as a foundational piece? Where do you think I'm going wrong with it? And they use the feedback that they're getting at that stage to kind of shape the story. I would never want to do that. But
I would get something as good as I could by myself. And the way that I do that is this is much easier than a short story, but I do this for novels as well, is that I retype everything.
Yes, I remember you saying that.
You were horrified when I told you this. It's a tip that I read in an interview by Joan Didion in the Paris Review. And I love the Paris Review interviews are brilliant because they're technical, practical discussions of craft with great writers, and you read them and you see just everyone has a completely different working method, and you can try on different things, see what works for you. And I read that Joan Didion retypes everything, and she got it from I think Hemingway, and so I thought I'll try that. I love it because I think sometimes when I'm writing a short story, it might be that I've sort of had a bolt of inspiration and I've written for a whole morning, you know, and then I've collected the children from school, and then I've let them watch a film while I carry on writing, you know, kind of still surfing this thing. Or it might be that a short story that I've had kind of bits and pieces of time, and I've kind of rushed to my computer and added a few lines. And what I find is that if I print out and I retype for every draft, it sort of streamlines the writing process. It brings me as close to experiencing it as a reader as possible as I retype it. But I think also crucially, it allows a short story to be live for me until the very final draft. Because if you're trying to edit on screen, I find it's very hard to unsee bad words or to get away from the inevitability of the lines that come next. You know, it's like bars on a window. But if you're retyping back in from scratch, I always think that you're leaving room for you're retyping your dialogue, and you're leaving room for character to say or do something that, you know, in 7 drafts of this story, they just didn't say. And then draft 8, you know them a bit better, they suddenly say something surprising, and you go with that. And then if it doesn't work, it's fine. You just delete it and you go back to a previous draft. So I would retype, and I think that's a way of so every draft I do, I would print out and I would retype in a different Word doc. I think that would be my top editing tip.
It's all about disrupting the relationship between the writer and the text. Ultimately, it's all about whatever you can do to kind of change your relationship as writer to the words on the screen. So when you are, I mean, it makes perfect sense to me that would work to do that, because you are changing from being the writer putting the words into the page to being a transcriber ultimately. And so your brain is kind of detached from the creative side of it, and it's looking at the mechanical side of it. So it's free to observe and to sort of think about the words in a different way.
Yeah, some people read things out loud. I think that's really important. Or some people change the font so that they're seeing it in a different way. We should get into, I want to leave room for people's questions, so do start putting your questions in the chat, but we should get in, Rachel, into the sort of nuts and bolts of award submission. And I think one very useful thing to say is when I was writing short stories for about 10 years before they started working for me, and they just didn't work. There's a poem by Sylvia Plath called Stillborn, and she imagines her poems that have failed kind of like in jars, you know, in sort of mason jars, and she says they smile and smile and smile at me, and still their lungs won't fill and their hearts won't start. And I always felt that about my stories. They just wouldn't come to life. And at this stage, you know, I did a kind of, a lot of the time people publish a collection of short stories first before novels. But I think before my short stories started working, I published 3 novels, several plays, stage plays, radio dramas. And then my short stories, I finally felt they started working. But I was a bit embarrassed in case they didn't. And I remember sending one of my stories in to the BBC Award because it was anonymous. And I just thought, no one's going to know this is me. And I thought it's really important to say that when we read these stories for the Mairtín Crawford Award, they are completely anonymous. We don't know the name of all we have is we have the title, and we have the word count, and we have the words. We don't know the name of the person submitting. We don't know if they have any publication history or if this is literally the first thing they've ever written. We don't know their gender. We don't know anything else about them. So it is judged purely anonymously. And I think that's kind of really liberating, especially if you're feeling self-conscious about sending something off. I think that's really important to say. And I think what I also want to say before we start discussing the nuts and bolts of this award submission is don't be disillusioned. You know, there have been some of the stories that I consider among my best have not got anywhere in competitions that they might have been submitted to, or journals to which they've been submitted. And other stories, you know, maybe someone has submitted a story on my behalf, as happens once you have a publisher or you've been edited in an anthology, and that has got somewhere. And I've thought, this is not my best work. So
why this one when I've sent you the other one, which is better.
And so I think it's always worth remembering that by the time we are reading these stories, there might be hundreds and hundreds of entries, and a team will read them, but you are subject to their taste, how they're feeling on that day, whether or not they've happened to read 2 stories just before yours about a dead dog. There are all these vagaries. So I think that when you're sending a story into a competition, don't calibrate your sense of worth too much to that story. Always remember that. And there are always stories, Chris Wright, who's our co-judge, he was one of the winners in our competition a couple of years ago, and he said, there's a really moving piece actually on the Crescent's website, the Belfast Book Festival's website, and he said that was a story that he had sent off and it had various rejections, and just as a sort of long shot he put it in for the competition, and we happened to read and love it. And so it's not even the two different judges on a different day might love your story. So when you're sending something in, I think do bear in mind it is a sort of posh bingo, as that phrase of Julian Barnes. But with kind of all those caveats, Rachel, I wanted to ask you, when you were a sifter for a couple of years on the awards, so these days you read like the 20 or 25 like me that are given to us, but when you were a sifter, you were reading all of the stories. So when you're doing that, can you talk us through what you're looking for? Is there anything that makes you instantly reject a short story, or is there anything that makes you instantly put one through to the next stage?
So instantly put through, no. I can be instantly intrigued, and I think the piece of advice that I had years ago, which I still hold by, is if you can get a reader to to go past the first line, then you want them to go past the first paragraph, then you want them to go past the first page. If you can get them to go past the first page, they're probably going to finish reading it. But if you have, for whatever reason, lost them in that first paragraph, then the chances are they're not going to finish reading the story. So that's why the really, really important thing is to get your opening section working as hard for you as you possibly can, and make sure, obviously, once you've got them invested in the story, they are not going to chuck you out for a formatting fail on page 7 or, a couple of typos. But if those typos or that formatting fail appears in those first lines, you've lost their confidence to a certain extent. So I've never rejected outright within that first couple of lines, but I've usually my instinct with those first few lines has usually played out across the rest of the story. So I really cannot, with something that is, any kind of competitive story submission process, those opening lines really have to be doing a lot of hard work for you. And that doesn't have to be sort of big explosions or, huge, like, weighty plot points. It can be something really just an incredibly arresting image. It can be a really interesting character beat. It can be a half sentence that appears to set up one thought, but then kind of twists in the middle and goes in an intriguing direction that you weren't expecting. It can be a really interesting line of dialogue. It just has to be working as hard for you as you can possibly make it, because that is very often where that first impression that you get is very often going to be the best chance that you have of persuading a reader to read on. And that's not just the case, obviously, in competitive submissions. That's the case anywhere that you encounter a short story. There's all kinds of sort of research that says how long it takes us to make up our minds about something or a person, and it's really, really not very long at all. So that's kind of key for me, is making sure that opening line, that opening paragraph, that opening page is setting your story off in its very best light.
For me, sometimes it's something much quieter as well. It's a sure-footedness or
confidence. Yeah.
And I think you can feel sometimes if something has been overworked, and we're kind of going back to the writing and editing here, but sometimes I think write your opening last.
Yes.
Because it's not till one thing that we do see, at least that I've noticed judging this competition and similar competitions, is quite often people don't quite know how to end. It's as if they've suddenly run out of words.
Yes.
And the ending is a bit of, and I think that if you can write your story, work out where it ends, and after that, when for me, the ending is almost more important because it's the tone that you're leaving the reader with. It's the thing that's going to grow with them. You know, it's the afterglow, all of that. And I think once you know that, and maybe you don't necessarily know that when you're starting, once you know that, you can work out, okay, if the story is going to end like up here, then I need to start it down here, you know, or if it's going to end, where do I start? And so quite often for me, actually, the opening, my first draft openings are very rough, and writing the opening is one of the last things I do, because I know the story by then, I know the world by then, I can write with that kind of quiet confidence.
Yeah, and that's something that I say quite often to writers when I'm working with them, is it's very common that you can't write the opening line until you've written the closing line, because the two of them are they are kind of a dyad, really. They are two halves of the same coin. The one should speak to the other and inform the other, just through whatever themes they're sort of positing and sort of summing up. So yeah, I mean, I think for me, I very, very rarely end up with the opening line that I start with.
Yeah.
Because
is there, in terms of subject matter as well, is there anything that would make you, are you looking for any kind of story, do you think? This is your prompt to say no.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's one of those things, you know it when you see it, but to sort of to kind of try and put a finger on it, it's almost impossible. It's trying to nail jelly to a wall, because there are so many things, from the momentous to the minutiae, that can all form the basis of a really powerful and effective short story. And it does come down to how well the writer knows their subject matter and their characters. And when I say subject matter, that's not research, that's knowing what your story is and what it's about. It's having the confidence to let that depth shine through, and the confidence to not overly explain it as well, because when you have a good sense of your story and a good sense of your character, and the confidence in your words, then the ability to trust your reader promotes that engagement. I mean, it's always going to be more effective for a reader to have to take that one little step forward into the text and to make those judgment calls yourself. And when you're rewarded then by something that the text kind of breadcrumbs for you, and it gives you the tools to make those conclusions yourself, that's much more rewarding for a reader than having it explained. So there is that tension, I suppose, between how much do I need to give the reader to be able to understand what's going on, versus if I explain this explicitly, then I'm going to lose something of the relationship that I'm trying to build between. So I think, yeah, when you say confidence, that's why I kind of nodded a lot, because it does take confidence in your work and in your reader as well. And that's something that's it can feel quite hard to let go of, you know, the control and the need to sort of go, well, no, this is what I meant. Whereas your reader can probably discern that from less information than you think.
There's Toni Morrison talks about subsequent drafts for her being adding color, adding layer, adding depth. Someone like Brian Moore, on the other hand, would be like cut, pare it completely back. So we sort of, we don't know what we're looking for, but we can recognize when we see it. I don't know how.
It's not very helpful, is it?
But I think I want that to be a sort of freedom for people who are thinking you cannot second guess the judges or what they like. You know, I love reading sci-fi. You wouldn't know that from the sort of stories that I produce. But there's nothing. I love reading young adult fiction. There's no way that a story is going to be rejected because it's the wrong genre or because it's the wrong style, or, you know, there's no point trying to think what's topical. And
yes,
like a topical story.
Sometimes that can actually work against you, I think. I mean, the first year I was the sifter was obviously during the pandemic, and you know, I was reading during lockdown, and a lot of stories that came through that year were about lockdown, which is a completely understandable reaction. I mean, we
had a couple of very good ones that were shortlisted.
Yeah, but a lot of them were, it was about the writer's response to lockdown, and that's a perfectly valid approach to take, but there wasn't a story there. And so I think unless you can work out, how to create a story which is a story that, it's a discrete story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and sort of takes the reader on a journey and allows the reader to understand the character's perspective and the character's journey through that story, then writing something topical just because it's topical is not necessarily a great approach to take. There has to be a reason for that, and I've seen since in recent years I've seen a lot of stories that have taken lockdown as their jumping off point, and they've used it to explore aspects of what happens to relationships when they are kind of put into that petri dish almost, or a fabulous one which it's a ghost story that could only exist during lockdown because it's using lockdown in that very strategic way. But the difference there is that lockdown is informing the story. The story isn't just lockdown.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Let's I do want to do get putting your questions in the chat. The one very important thing I would say about award submission, Rachel, that I know you want to talk about as well, is let's talk formatting.
Yes.
Let's talk
Sorry.
Reading the submission guidelines.
Yes.
Right, if the submission says size 12 font and double spaced, that's for a reason. Do you want to talk us through, Rachel, because this is a bugbear of yours, isn't it?
It is a bit, yeah. Yes, and I don't know whether this is true or not, but I have heard that some competitions, agents, publishers have very, very specific and slightly odd formatting guidelines, purely because they want to see that you've read the submission guidelines and they want to check that you have paid attention, which kind of makes sense to me, because it is one of the ways that you can, I don't want to say let your work down, that's really unfair and that's overly generalizing, but if the formatting is off, then you've lost part of the reader's confidence.
So by formatting, we mean here the font that you're writing in, the size of the font, whether or not you can use, like, you want 1.5 line or a double space. Just give some space between the lines and give the reader space to see it.
Yes.
Things like dialogue, I do not care whether you have no quotation marks, whether you use like an M dash, like say Joyce would, or Tessa Hadley quite often uses an M dash, which is where each line of dialogue is indicated by a dash, or whether you're using, full speech marks. But it is not, you do want someone to look like they have an awareness of what they're doing, that things that they're using the same sort of format consistently. Sometimes if someone starts with speech marks and then there's no speech mark, and then you just think this isn't, someone they're not fully in control of what they're doing, they haven't reread this. Pick a couple of books off your shelf and just see that, say, when you start a new paragraph, there's a tab indent. If you want a bigger break, you can use a line break. These formatting things, it can take a story from looking quite amateur to looking completely polished. And professional.
Yeah, and that level of polish is going to kind of imprint itself to a certain extent on how the words come across. It may not be fair, but it is what it is. That if a story doesn't look like it has been given that polish, then it's going to feel less polished to read. And I completely agree with you. Like I have no I have a slight preference for quotation marks, but only very slight, and as long as the formatting is consistent, as you know, and you're doing it strategically and doing it on purpose, I think you go with what works best for your story. But if you are going to use that sort of traditional speech marks, it's really important to know what the rules are around them, because there is a place where the comma goes. If you're having, so he, she, it said, after that or before it, it's part of the same sentence. There's no full stop before the she said, and all sorts of things like that. And this is where relying on autocorrect or whatever it's called now, I'm just getting old, isn't necessarily your best friend, because quite often Microsoft Word will see an exclamation mark or a question mark in quotation marks and close the sentence and start the next, it will autocorrect the she said to a capital, which is just wrong. And it's one of the very few things which can be actually wrong in a story. Most of the time it's a question of taste or it's a question of style, but there are rules about things like dialogue, punctuation, that just familiarizing. There's an absolutely phenomenal resource about this on the web called the Editor's Blog, where she talks, and I think I've given this link to literally every single class I've ever done, because the thing about dialogue formatting is that you're taught it maybe once, and then if you don't use it, you don't remember, so you don't know what you don't know. But the Editor's Blog, I'll see if I can pop the link in the chat, possibly, because it's such a great resource. She goes through literally every permutation of dialogue formatting that you could possibly wish for and shows you how to do it and explains why. So it's just really, really useful.
Brilliant. I'm going to start looking at the questions now, but my last question to you, Rachel, is our first way as judges, as readers, of encountering a story is, oh, there's a ghost in your machine, Rachel.
Oh, not again. Sorry. That's me going off to try and find this.
Off and on, there you go. The first thing that we encounter with a short story is the title. And so how can you, what's a good title for you?
Oh, I hate titles. I hate titles. They're the last thing to come for me most of the time, and they are so unsatisfactory most of the time that I end up. And my two novels, I mean, my one bit of advice for titles, I suppose, if you're writing a novel, is pick a title that's not going to throw up multiple false positives on a Google search. I mean, pick something that's going to be at least slightly original or not.
You had a story, you had a title that was kind of quite banal, and your story wasn't getting anywhere. You changed the title and it got snapped up. Can you tell us about that?
Well, that's the same one that changed the perspective, the main character point of view. So it was just called The Doll, because I hate titles. And it was about a doll.
Kind of so generic. It's fine. That's an okay title, not a particular title.
And then it became Little Feet, because I had more of a sense about what it was that the story was actually about, and I had more of a sense of where the creep comes from in it. So, you know, the sound of little feet pitter-pattering on the floor when there's no child running around, I mean, that is legitimately one of my nightmares. So that's sort of when that kind of came together for me. But I don't know, these days I usually put the title off until the very last, and
sometimes I find that either I'll have it right from the beginning, or I won't have it to the end, or something will suggest it to me. I always think with a title, it's worth asking yourself, is your title, what's your title doing for you?
Yes.
Is your title revealing something, or is your title concealing something?
Yes.
Or is your title intriguing?
Yeah.
And one of my favorite titles, not of my story sadly, is the story by Lucia Berlin, and it's called Her First Detox.
Yes.
And I love that because it's the story, whether or not we consciously register, the fact that it's not called, you know, the detox facility or her detox, it's her first detox. Yeah. So we know that there are more. Yeah. So the story, so the work that's done, that story I think does so much heavy lifting, and it instantly gives the reader, there's a dramatic irony at play, because the reader instantly knows more than the character. So the story is written with a real lightness of touch. Her drinking has got a little bit out of control, but she feels that she's sorted, and we know that the story has caught her just on the beginning of this downward spiral.
There's kind of a fatalism to it there, but no matter what she does in that story, she can't actually,
we know that she's doomed. And so the story is kind of light and it's playful and it's working against this knowledge that we have. So I think that's really good. I think one of the titles of mine that I like best is All the People Were Mean and Bad.
Yes,
it's quite hard to have a long title that doesn't feel like a title that's too tricksy, but I just sort of thought that that's kind of strange and startling, and yet has a sort of rhythm to it. I was very pleased with that title when I came up with it. So it's hard to work out. So I would ask yourself, you know, sometimes we don't have much control of these things, but I would ask yourself with your title, how much of the work can it do? You know, when we talk about how much of the story is written, you know, this hour in flight, how much is happening before the story even begins on the page? What can your title do to suggest that? How can your title cut us in? How can your title be playful? How can your title be working for you? Of course, it's fine. You know, I have also written titles that are written stories that have titles that are, you know, slightly generic. Not all of your titles are going to be jazz handsy. But I think, yeah, I wanted to talk with you. Let's so that's the title, a few words in the title. Okay, so let's see. What's our best tip for crafting a satisfactory ending? Yeah, that's such a good question. And I would say, with a novel, with a play, I always know what the ending is going to be. I don't plan like you do, Rachel, but I always think that if my subconscious knows, I can trust myself to get there. But I love the sense of writing a short story. Sometimes I know what the ending is going to be, but sometimes I do what Claire Keegan describes as just like pushing a bike off a hill.
Right.
Freewheeling, not knowing how far you're going to go, how fast you're going to go, where you're going to end up. And so sometimes it will be that a short story will sort of take me by surprise and the story will end before I thought it was going to.
Right.
But it'll be obvious that it's the end because I've run out of road.
Yes.
You know? Or it might be that actually the thing that I talked about, the sort of the transformation, has happened. You know, we've reached that realization, and pushing the story on any longer, it's not going to be as interesting. I always do a sort of thing with my stories, is that I do play about with, almost as if you're sort of toggling like dials at either end. And I always think, what would happen if I started this story earlier? You know, what would happen if I started it a year earlier? What would happen if I started a scene earlier? And I do that with an ending as well. To test out an ending for me, I always think, okay, this is where the story seems to have ended, but what would happen if I cut off the ending and ended at a scene earlier? And what's often quite interesting is you'll find, if you read say Chekhov, if you do like take a Chekhov story, take a Joyce story, take an Alice Munro story, and, you know, cut off the final page or the final half page or the final paragraph, and you will feel that there's something about the story, it's just a narrative. It's that final bit that makes it kind of rise, that makes it coalesce, that makes it all make sense. And for me, that'll be the bit that you're writing towards. It'll be the bit where the story kind of lifts off. And so you'll feel, if you do it with a really great story, you'll feel that if you end too early, what we're just getting narrative. You know, we're not getting story, we're not getting the magic. And I think similarly, I will always, with my own stories, I'll sort of test, I'll say, what would happen if I continued writing on? And what I'll feel is that the sort of intense moment is gone and the story starts to become thin again. It starts to become less interesting. And so for me, that's I do it kind of instinctively to a large degree, but I will also test it. You know, and I will sort of see, what would happen if I carried out this, if I let this story run on, either let the scene continue like or let the story, you know, spool on for another week, another year, another 10 years. And quite often that's just a way of testing that my story is ending at that kind of heightened moment. Kevin Barry always says that if you want to know what a short story is about, look at the penultimate paragraph. And as soon as I read that, I thought, oh no, and I went through all of my stories and I was like, oh gosh, penultimate paragraph. So, you know, there are sort of but there is that sense of, especially if you're writing, you know, 2,500 words, it is, your story is probably going to be like rising towards the ending, and once the ending has happened, you kind of want to sum up and get out of there, or maybe the story ends right on that moment of realization, you know.
I mean, I think one of the greatest bits of advice, I can't remember where I read it either now, which is ridiculous, but a great bit of advice I read about sort of ending of any piece at all is, rather than think about it as the end of the story, think about it as the beginning of what comes next. So if you've got too much after the end, then you've written the beginning of the next phase of the character's life rather than ending that particular story. I had a really, really useful experience when I was a tiny little baby writer, where a fax machine, because it's that long ago, cut off the end, the last page of a story that I was faxing to somebody I was working with.
I love this.
And the feedback from him was just, it was really positive. It's like, oh my goodness, that's such a strong place to end. It's left us with it's tied up all the questions, but it's left us with other questions. It's left us wanting to know more, whereas it's still, and I think that's really key, you have to answer or at least address the central conflict that has driven the narrative. And he's, it's done all of that, but it's left us with more questions. What happens next? And I went, but there's a whole other page which tells you what happens next. And he went, no, it's gone. Forget it. That doesn't exist anymore, because the fax machine had intervened. The best editor I've ever had. And it's a real revelation then about how much less you need than you think you do. And with the short story, because of the constraints of the form, a lot of the luxuries that you have with the novel of addressing each plot point individually, you don't necessarily have that with a short story. So a lot of it is going to play out off screen, as it were, and you can allow that to happen as long as you sort of acknowledge that has happened, or that will happen, or that the information is there that the reader can infer that. A really nasty exercise I like doing sometimes is doing the plot points of a bit of flash fiction, and actually putting together what the narrative structure looks like of the story that the flash fiction is telling, which involves inferring a lot of information, but a piece of flash fiction that's working effectively gives you the tools to infer that information. It's there. How you infer it will depend very much on how you have your own reception of that story, and the context cues you're using from your own life to make those decisions and those determinations about the character. But the information is there in the story that allows you to make those leaps. So,
yeah, so interesting. We have another really good question here that is this has been a great session. Thank you. It's about what I said about not feeling that my short stories came to life till a certain point. Can I ask what changed to make your stories work? Yeah, do you know what it was? I used to write short stories as if they were prose. I started writing short stories. I'd written my first novel, and I thought, I've written a novel, how hard can a short story be? Which I think is the classic kind of rookie error. It's short and
it must be easier for some reason, but not
it's far more difficult. I love the short story. When they started working, I really felt I have found my form, and I think it's kind of easier to write a novel than it is a great short story.
I wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah, and it's something to do with when my short stories started working. I would have what I thought was a good idea, and I'd write it. It would be a good sort of narrative, good story, and it would do that thing, like I said, it would have kind of flickers of life, but it wouldn't be more than the sum of its parts. And I think there's something about a great short story that requires you as a reader to rise to it, to hold your breath and to go with it, and to read it in one go. And a short story can be at a pitch, at an intensity that a novel just couldn't sustain.
Absolutely.
And I started realizing when my short stories started working, I stopped seeing them as prose narratives in miniature, and I started seeing them as much more akin to poems, like tightly formally constructed, maybe heightened in tone. I started seeing them as plays, or crucially for me, I started seeing them as spells. I started thinking them as spells, and I started thinking what my stories are doing. It's less about what happens. Some of my short stories have a lot of plot, some have almost no plot at all, but I managed to sort of unhitch myself from plot requirements, and instead I started writing words and rhythms and sentences in a particular order to conjure up a mood or to conjure up an atmosphere. And so that's when my stories started feeling very, very alive. And so they started becoming about nuances of character and acute sort of sensitivities of feeling, and conjuring up the mood of a particular place or a particular time with a heightened atmosphere of something. Now, you know that if you read a book on what are the plots and what should a short story be, you will never find anything like that there. And you know, I was looking at a short story by Alice Munro with some of my writing students recently, and someone pointed out that we have 24 time jumps in the story, 24 different timelines. And it's like, if you read any book, they will say, have a consistency of timeline, you know. But Alice Munro, she's doing something where she's not writing chronological time. She's writing with a sort of emotional fidelity of time as we experience it, time as we remember it. And so I think, so going with, again, it's there will be ways of writing and understanding fiction that work for you that you won't find in any how-to book. And it's about sharpening your own instincts as to what makes a good story, and practicing those, and reading stories that are similar to your own. I think that was when I started feeling that my short stories had some kind of life. But I think that's going to be different for every single writer, you know, for every single person. For some people, having a good story, you know, will be a story that has a lot of plot, or a story that has unexpected plot, a story that has satisfying twists and turns. But that was if for what it means to you, Pamela, that was what changed for me. Really, though, I think it was just trying and the story's not working, and just, you know, keeping on thinking this form was really, really magical, and keeping on reading, keeping on trying.
I think kind of it's about finding your voice as well, and finding the story that only you can tell.
Yeah, and I think realizing you have your voice already. You know, your voice isn't something that you have to go out with a sort of, you know, handkerchief on a string around the world to. You have it, and so it's working out what is exactly that combination of what are the stories that only you can tell, which don't need to be stories that you personally have lived or experienced. Exactly. It could be stories that only you could dream into being, stories that only your imagination has access to. And the magical thing is there will be as many of those as there are writers. And when we say we don't know what we're looking for, it's because we genuinely don't know if we're going to have, you know, a horror story winning this, you know, set in the 17th century or the 14th century, or if we're going to have a sort of very, very nuanced coming of age realist. We just don't know. That's the exciting thing.
Yeah, that's it. I think the other thing is, you know, tell a story that can only be told in short story form as well. Because like you say, it's not, and I find people sometimes apologize for being short story writers, as though it's, you know, it's kind of like the less illustrious cousin of the novel writer. And that's just I don't know where that's come from. I mean, the idea that you know, short story must be less than just because it's got a shorter word count. It's not. It is a different format. I write far fewer short stories than, well, that's not true. I have far fewer short story ideas than I have novel ideas, because crafting something into sort of 2,500 words is much, much more difficult than expanding something into 100,000 words. It sounds completely counterintuitive, but it's true. Some stories can only be told in novel format. So it's finding the story that is the short story, and not sort of a story that you're cramming into 2,500 words. It's the story that must be told in 2,500 words.
That's really interesting. I think there are no more questions in the chat box here, but this is your final call to put something in into the chat box if you do have a question.
I'm going to try and very quickly find this link to the editor's blog.
Yeah, that'd be really useful. Yeah, if anyone has one final question, one burning question, put it into the chat box for us to see.
Okay. Here's, I see I've disappeared again. Let's get rid of that.
This blog. Brilliant. I hope that's really useful.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's just wonderful.
I'm reminded of the letter to hope again. I once wrote a short letter, but I didn't have time, so I sent a long one. Brilliant. I love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
Well, yes, I hope this has been informative for you all, and I hope that most of all, I hope you feel inspired to go away and write the stories that only you can, and send them in for the competition. Do double check all of the eligibility requirements and the deadlines, but we hope to get reading your story very soon.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading them. Really, it's always a joy to read the short stories for the Mairtín Crawford.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.